The Atlanta Braves were certainly the team of the 90s in the National League. Meanwhile, during this period, the NL team that represented the Lone Star State had the second most wins in the National League during the 90s, but ran into some unfortunate luck in what was an interesting decade. 90 Sports Nostalgia presents the Houston Astros in the 90s. Let's briefly start off with the 80s, where the Houston Astros were decent. One reason for this competitive stretch was due to the pitching duet of Mike Scott and Nolan Ryan. But after the 1988 season, the 41-year-old Nolan Ryan would leave Houston and sign with the Texas Rangers. Mike Scott, the 1986 Cy Young Award winner, would be an All-Star in 1989, but injuries began to take a toll on Scott, as his last MLB season was in 1991. As for the rest of the team, the Astros would be kind of transitioning into a new team with some youth. Two young players who were getting playing time in the late 80s were Craig Biggio and Ken Caminiti. More on Caminiti later, but as for Biggio, the New York native was a Silver Slugger Award winner as a catcher in 1989. Later on, Biggio would transition into a second baseman due to management fearing that the rigors of being behind the plate would hinder Biggio's athleticism. Art Howe would be in his first season as Houston's manager in 1989, as the Astros finished that season 86-76. Conversely, the team declined, going 75-87 in 1990. Around this time, a couple of fascinating trades took place. On August 30th, 1990, 37-year-old reliever Larry Anderson, who was solid for the Astros out of the bullpen, was traded for Jeff Bagwell. This has been labeled as one of the worst trades in Red Sox history. Furthermore, on January 10th, 1991, the Astros traded their top run producer in Glenn Davis to Baltimore for Steve Finley, Pete Harnisch, and Curt Schilling. This has been labeled as one of the worst trades in Orioles history. During the mid to late 80s, Davis seemed to have been the only major home run threat for the Astros, but Houston traded Davis at the right time, as a powerful right-handed hitter was far from the type of player he was in Houston, mainly due to a nerve injury in his neck. On the other hand, Harnisch was a solid pitcher. Curt Schilling was a reliever and was later traded for Jason Grimsley. As for Finley, I'll talk more about him later on. The 1991 Houston Astros had a completely different lineup than the previous season. An interesting quintet of younger players in Biggio, Bagwell, Caminiti, Finley, and Luis Gonzalez got the chance to play every day in Houston. Jeff Bagwell became Rookie of the Year, while Craig Biggio was an All-Star catcher in 1991, but the Astros declined again, going 65-97. However, better days would be ahead. Heading into the 1992 season, Biggio would be moving from catcher to second base. This in a way prompted the Astros to basically trade center fielder Kenny Lofton for catching prospect Eddie Taubensee. Looking back on it, it seemed like a great deal, as the Astros were comfortable with Finley playing center field and Biggio heading to second base, and thus, the Astros acquired a solid catching prospect to fit in with the youth movement. Unfortunately, Taubensee didn't quite play up to the expectations, and as a result, there are those who labeled this one as one of the worst trades in Astros history. But on the bright side, Houston finished the 92 campaign with an 81-81 record, which included the Astros going 27-13 in their last 40 games. One quick note about this season, the 92 season also included an unheard of 26 consecutive game road stretch. 1993 would be the last season where only two teams from each league would go to the MLB playoffs, but unfortunately, the Astros are in the NL West with the Atlanta Braves, who just signed Greg Maddux, and the San Francisco Giants, who just signed Barry Bonds. With a nice young nucleus in the everyday lineup, Houston decided to go all out and sign starting pitchers Doug Drabek and Greg Swindell. However, the signings did not quite pan out as the Astros would have liked. On the plus side, Houston did finish with an 85-77 record, good for third in the AL West, but far behind Atlanta and San Fran. Things would begin to drastically change for the 1994 season, with a new logo, a new playoff format. Moreover, the Astros hired a new manager who was the complete opposite of Art Howe and Terry Collins. While Howe was more laid back, Collins is energetic, fiery, and demanding of his players. The core of the Houston Astros were in their prime. Houston got off to a slow start, but beginning in late May, the Astros found themselves right with the Cincinnati Reds, battling for the first ever NL Central Division title. Unfortunately, a work stoppage transpired in August, and as a result, the remainder of the 94 season was canceled. It seemed that the Astros were robbed of a chance to make the postseason for the first time since 1986. However, it wouldn't have been easy if the season continued. That's because a couple of days before the strike, Jeff Bagwell, who really exploded in 1994, was hit by a pitch from Andy Bennis that fractured his left wrist. Furthermore, Bagwell being hit in the hand region was an issue for him during the mid-90s due to his approach to incoming pitches. But if there was one positive that could have been taken from the strike, it's that Bagwell probably would have not been named MVP. As mentioned earlier, Bagwell fractured his wrist and would have missed the rest of the '94 season if there wasn't a work stoppage. If there was ever going to be an end to the strike, 1995 was seemingly going to be a successful season for Houston. However, a shocking 12-player trade occurred. This all according to GaslampBall.com, which is a San Diego Padres fan community site from SB Nation. The Padres had new ownership and were looking to improve and to do so by taking on salary. On the other hand, the Astros were looking to cut payroll. Houston and San Diego made a trade which included each team exchanging 6 players. The main players the Astros sent to San Diego were Ken Caminiti and Steve Finley, while the main return Houston got was Derek Bell. Of course, the trade worked out well for San Diego. Now I want to try to stay away from the whole steroid issue and want to stay away from accusing players of using steroids. However, it should be noted that Ken Caminiti admitted to steroids during his 1996 MVP season. But the point I want to make is that there is no way the Astros could have predicted the type of numbers Ken Caminiti and Steve Finley would put up in San Diego. Now I'm not accusing Steve Finley of taking steroids, but like I said, the point is that there is no way Houston could have predicted these type of offensive numbers from these 2 Golden Glove caliber players. The same point goes for Luis Gonzalez, who's traded in the middle of the '95 season to the Cubs and then would come back to the Astros for the '97 season and would later on put up huge numbers for Arizona. The strike would finally end and teams would begin regular season play in late April. Derek Bell would wind up having his best season for the Astros in 1995. Greg Biggio, of course, had another solid season. Jeff Bagwell, who was in a slump in May, would once again get hit by a pitch and would break a bone in Bagwell's left hand, which forced the first baseman to miss a month. Houston finished above 500 with a 76-68 record. But quietly, the Astros are building a nice young pitching staff with Shane Reynolds, Darryl Kile, and Mike Hampton, who was acquired in a trade from Seattle in 1993. In addition, Billy Wagner was developing into becoming a reliable closer. In 1996, Cincinnati did not have as good as a roster as they did the previous year, meaning the Killer Bees and that underrated pitching staff. Houston seemed like the best team in a weaker NL Central. For most of the '96 season, Houston was on top of their division, but the Astros went through a rough stretch in September, going 4-16. Consequently, manager Terry Collins was fired. Enter the 1997 season, and surprisingly, Larry Dierker would be the new manager hired directly from the broadcasting booth. I remember Dierker making a point to let his pitchers go deeper into games. The Houston Astros finished 3rd in team ERA and 5th in the NL in runs scored. Houston finally broke through and won a division title, but got swept by the Braves in the divisional round. Atlanta had clearly established themselves as a class of the NL, but Astros GM Jerry Hunsaker would be adding more talent to this already solid roster that put the Astros on the same level with the Braves. Now you already know about Bagwell and Biggio. Defensive specialist Brad Ausmus would come over from Detroit in a trade to be the catcher. Derek Bell would have a bounce-back year in '98, and Carl Everett was acquired in a very underrated trade to play center. With the Marlins having a fire sale, the Astros made a tremendous acquisition by obtaining Moises Alou in a trade. As for the pitching, Darryl Kile, who had a tremendous '97 campaign, would leave to sign with Colorado, but the starting staff was still solid with Shane Reynolds, Mike Hampton, Sean Bergman, and 25-year-old Jose Lima, who would get his chance to start for the Astros. But the biggest acquisition this team made was when they made a mid-season trade for Randy Johnson. The big unit was going to be a rental player with his contract up at the end of the season, but this trade wound up being phenomenal for Houston. The 1998 Astros led the NL in runs scored and was 2nd in the NL in team ERA. This was a very good team, especially with the way Randy Johnson was pitching in an Astros uniform. The 1998 Astros definitely had the talent to win the first World Series in franchise history. However, in my opinion, I felt the Astros got unlucky with the horrible draw going up against Kevin Brown and the San Diego Padres in a best-of-5 divisional series. For a 3-year period from 1996 to 1998, pitcher Kevin Brown was one of the best pitchers I had ever seen. Brown threw hard with tremendous movement and was able to command his pitches effectively. Furthermore, the 6'4" righty with seemingly long arms was one of the best at making pitches to change a hitter's eye level. Brown also hit the ball well and came at hitters with several different arm angles in combination with his unique delivery. The Padres ace was a nightmare for right-handed hitters, and unfortunately for the Astros, their lineup was right-handed heavy with their top run producers hitting from the right side. The ultra-intense Brown won a couple of 2-1 decisions. The Padres won the divisional series 3-1. Despite the rough ending, the 1999 season looked to be promising despite Randy Johnson leaving to sign with Arizona. The pitching staff still had Mike Hampton, Jose Lima, and Shane Reynolds, and the offense was still in place. However, during the offseason, Moises Alou strangely suffered a torn ACL from a treadmill accident. The 99 Astros were not as good as last year's team, but still managed to win the Central for a third year in a row and yet again got bounced out of the divisional round by the Atlanta Braves. The 1999 season would be the last season the Astros would play in the Astrodome, and the last season they'd wear the dark blue caps with the unique gold logo. During the 90s, Houston had a good run, but unfortunately had some bad luck, and the Atlanta Braves in the 90s got in the way of the Astros from ever making it past the divisional round. Nevertheless, the 90s was an entertaining decade for the Houston Astros.